cold and succeeding hot fits. During one of these fits, while again considering the problem of the origin of species, something led me to think of Malthus' essay on population. Now, he's talking about an essay that was written by Thomas Malthus about how the human populations were multiplying faster than the food supply could take care of them, and so he argued, and Herbert Spencer argued, and others of that point of view at that time argued that they shouldn't do anything to help the poverty-stricken classes, let them die off because there was not enough food anyway, so it's better to let the ones who were more fit to survive live. And Darwin was influenced by that idea, and so was Wallace. He says, something led me to think of Malthus' essay on population. Then he says, it suddenly flashed upon me that this self-acting process would necessarily improve the race, because in every generation the inferior would inevitably be killed off, and the superior would remain. That is, the fittest would survive. Then at once I seemed to see the whole effect of this. The whole method of species modification became clear to me. And in the 2 hours of my fit, I had thought out all the main points of the theory. That same evening, I sketched out the draft of a paper, and in the 2 succeeding evenings, I wrote it out and sent it by the next post to Mr. Charles Darwin. He knew Darwin was interested in the same subject, and he thought he would be thrilled to find that he, Wallace, had found the secret to evolution. And so he sent this paper to Darwin, and when Darwin saw it, he got very unhappy about it because he had been developing the same theory for 20 years and hadn't published his, and so he got busy and wrote out a brief summary of it, and that came out as the book that we know as The Origin of Species. He probably never would have published his book, which has so profoundly influenced the world in the succeeding century, had Wallace not sent him this draft of his essay and spurred him to do that. Now note this. Wallace, in 2 hours of a fit, when he wasn't even himself and said it just flashed upon him, was able to do what Darwin had been taking 20 years to accomplish, not in the jungle like Wallace was, but in the midst of the most educated city in the world and amidst all the scientists and people there at Oxford and Cambridge and the London area. And it does seem like something is happening here that is not meeting the eye right on the surface. Loren Eiseley of the University of Pennsylvania, one of the greatest historians of science, commenting on this, put it this way, he says, a man pursuing birds of paradise in a remote jungle did not yet know that he had forced the world's most reluctant author to disgorge his hoarded volume, or that the whole of Western thought was about to be swung into a new channel because a man in a fever had felt a moment of strange radiance. Well, you can't help but wonder if something really occult was happening here. After all, Satan is surely interested in trying to turn men away from God, and evolution has been his main weapon in doing that. And had it not been for his ability perhaps to communicate through the spirits with Wallace, it may never have happened. A paper written by a man by the name of William Coleman, who's a spiritist, called Evolution of the Spiritual Universe. This was published in 1900, so it's an old book, but it was published after Darwin. But he's reviewing the history of evolutionism and writings on evolution in the Spiritist movement. And he says this, not only is the material universe a product of the law of evolution, but the spiritual realm as well. Nature's Divine Revelations, he's citing a book now, Nature's Divine Revelations, by Andrew Jackson Davis, that's the author, was delivered in trance, in a demonic trance in 1845 and 47, which was about 15 years before Darwin's book was published. And in that book he says the evolution of the material world by natural laws was taught, including the development of higher species from lower and of man from the animal world, and then also extended that on into the spiritual realm, so that the whole of the universe is in a process of evolution according to the spirits. And they were giving this to the spiritist mediums before Darwin. So it does seem like there may be something to the concept that evolution was the great weapon that was used at this time to change the whole tenor of thought in the so-called Christian world of the West. Well, but of course, not Wallace, not Darwin, not even Lamarck before them invented the theory of evolution. You can find many evolutionists before these people. They just were not as influential as Darwin turned out to be. Matter of fact, Darwin's grandfather, a man by the name of Erasmus Darwin, who was also an occultist and a pantheist and a medical doctor and a poet, he was a very influential man and wrote books on evolution before Charles Darwin was even born. And all the standard evidences for evolution that are still cited today in high schools and the public school system such as comparative anatomy and the embryological recapitulation theory and geographical distribution and natural selection and so on. All of these were advocated as evidences in favor of evolution by Erasmus Darwin even before Charles Darwin was ever born. So you see, there's nothing new about evolution. It goes way back, and you can go trace it back further than that, of course. And now we don't have time really to deal with this very thoroughly, but there was a concept back in the several centuries before Darwin known as the Great Chain of Being. And this concept was the idea that in all of the universe there was a complete chain from the highest to the lowest. The idea was that the great soul of the universe in ancient pantheism, whatever that great Mother Nature or whatever it was, that from that emanated the angels, the high spirits in the heavenly places. Then from these emanated human beings on the earth, the higher races, then the lower races, then the apes, and on down through the animal kingdom, down to the plants, and finally down to the rocks, and eventually to the dust. Everything from the smallest to the largest, and the most earthy to the most ethereal, was included in this concept of the great chain of being. And many of the philosophers of that period, in the 16th century, 17th century, and 15th century, in that period, they devoted their time to trying to find the missing links in that chain, because they knew they were there. By their theory, there had to be a complete chain without any gaps. And so they kept trying to find these missing links. And then, you see, this chain, or this, they also called it the scale of nature, which was complete in their theories, from the highest to the lowest. All you had to do to make an evolutionary chain out of that was to invert it and to put a time factor on it, and that's what happened then at the time of the development of the years just before Darwin, when they developed the idea of the great geological ages, and they tried to find ways to put the various fossils together which they were discovering, and they put them in an order based on the chain of being. And this is the time when the idea that there was an embryological recapitulation came into existence, in Germany primarily is where that was developed, some in France. That is, the development of each embryo had to go through this same great chain of being before it could become a human being. And they arranged the various plants and animals in a hierarchy, a classification system based on this concept of the great chain of being. So all the evidences that eventually became supposedly the evidences for evolution really came out of the concept of the great chain of being. Well, now where did that come from? Let me read a statement from a man who's written on this subject. This is a man in New Zealand, actually, Dr. D.R. Oldroyd. The title of his book is Darwinian Impacts. And he's pointing out that this all came from a philosophical system known as Neoplatonism. This was in the early centuries just after Christ. Neoplatonism has for long exerted a powerful influence in the Christian West, particularly in the Florentine period of the Renaissance. It might be said that the doctrine of the great chain of being formed part of the general mental furniture of most educated men from the Renaissance until almost the end of the 18th century. References to this great chain of being abound in Spencer, in Henry Moore, and Milton. One finds it in the philosophical writings of Leibniz, Spinoza, and Locke in the 17th century. In the 18th century, it was one of the standard ways of conceptualizing nature. The doctrine of the great chain of being probably had its last resting place, at least among biologists, among the German nature philosophers of the 19th century, immediately before Darwin's time. And they profoundly influenced Lamarck, who was Darwin's immediate predecessor, and you can find much evidence of it in Darwin's writing too. So the evolutionary philosophy, which we attribute to Charles Darwin, actually goes back further than that, finally going into this concept of the great chain of being through the Middle Ages. And then you ask, where did that come from? Well, it came from the system known as Neoplatonism, the founder of which was a man by the name of Plotinus. And Neoplatonism means it was a new form of the Platonic philosophy advocated by Plato and Aristotle and Socrates before them. And so you can trace this on back to the philosophies of Greece and Rome. And then you find, as you read the writings of those philosophers, that they also advocated an evolutionary system very much like modern evolutionism. For example, let me read just one example, and you could do this with many of them. This is from a philosopher by the name of Lucretius, and he's talking about how the world came to be and the different forms of structure came to be. He says, the atoms did not post themselves purposefully in due order by any act of intelligence, nor did they stipulate what movements each should perform. As they've been rushing everlastingly throughout all space in their myriads, undergoing myriad changes under the disturbing impact of collisions. They've experienced every variety of movement and conjunction